Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I'm Lorraine Macquart. Today is Tuesday when you're watching this, so that means that I'm doing my weekly reading wrap-up. This is the second one, so this is weekly reading number 2. I think I've decided that's going to be the title of these kind of videos. Anyway, I've got 3 books to talk about, so let's get cracking. The first one is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This is a classic, and if you don't know, Oliver Twist is about a young boy who is an orphan and who starts out in orphanages, which are not pretty, and he ends up on the streets and stuff happens. Now, you might notice, I didn't, that this is a kind of a small book. I got this from a friend from my book club and started reading it last week, Monday evening. And finished it the same evening. It was an evening that started late and stopped early, and in which I also cooked, ate, and watched TV. And I was reading it, and this is the Dutch version, and it was such an easy read. I was really surprised. So I kept looking. This is weird. Isn't this an abridged version or something? But I couldn't find anything. It says on the front youth classics, but still. But when I was done, I knew something was up, so I looked on Goodreads, and yes, normal Oliver Twist book has 600 pages approximately, so this is indeed, like I should have known, an abridged version for kids. Now, because I read this kids version, I didn't really get all of the descriptions about London life and how horrible that is, and elaborations on characters or anything. So it's hard to say what I think of this book, because essentially this was just an easy read with an interesting plot. I don't know whether I'm going to read the real Oliver Twist. If I read it, it's probably going to be in 10 years or such. The next book I read was not a disappointment at all, and I learned so much. It is the Franse Antifada by Hussey. I have the Dutch translation of this book because it's the one I saw in the bookshop, and the original title is the French Antifada. I already talked about this a little in my birthday book haul, so there might be some repetition, so I'm sorry for that. This is a non-fiction about the relationship between France and 3 of its former colonies, namely Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Andrew Hussey starts by describing the situation in the banlieue and the atmosphere that is there and the violence that has been going on in the past few years. And he makes the point that in order to understand that and where all the anger is coming from, you have to look at and understand the history of the countries that these people are originally from. So that is what he does. He describes the histories of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia ever since France took over, what the life was like when France was in charge, how the countries got their independence, and how they've been struggling basically ever since in order to become stable. While there are a lot of similarities between the 3 countries, there are also a lot of differences that I became aware of. For example, he starts with Algeria, and Algeria was taken over violently in 1830, and many French moved there, and they were called the Pieds Noirs. They saw themselves as originally from there because they would in the end live there for many generations, and Algeria was really seen as part of France. It wasn't just a colony, and that's also what made it hard to agree to give it its independence. And the Algerian War for Independence, which incidentally in France is just called the Algerian War, lasted for 10 years, and one of the reasons it was such a long war is because there were many parties, and that the Pieds Noirs really did not want Algeria to leave France because it was their country. The book really describes the violence and the war crimes that were perpetrated on both sides, well, on all of the sides of the war, and that was stupendous to read about. As I said, there were many sides to this war. There were Algerians fighting the French, obviously, but there were also Algerians that were fighting other Algerians because they felt that if they weren't fighting for independence, then they were automatically against. So there was also a lot of violence there. You had France, obviously, fighting the Algerians, but at one point the Pieds Noirs were also fighting both France and the Algerians because France was starting to have talks with Algeria about independence, and the Pieds-Noirs were not happy about that. When it comes to Tunisia and Morocco, the situation was slightly different from the get-go because they weren't taken over violently. The taken over was called a friendly penetration, I believe. And what the French did was that they made sure the leaders spent enormous amount of money on ridiculous stuff, and then they told the international community, well, they owe us a lot of money and they're obviously not capable of paying it back or looking after themselves, so we're taking over. And the international community was basically like, meh, okay, but we want that part. And then that happened. And also both countries kind of got their independence because France did not want to have a war like it was having in Algeria, but still this was a result of already violent protest and the situation being very explosive. But the book also shows the many similarities that there are. For example, how little rights the Algerians, the Moroccans, and the Tunisians had in their own country, and how they were not allowed to have their own culture and not allowed to have a say, obviously. How they were hungry, were poor, how that then led, of course, to protests and violence, and how that violence was really a result of all of the pent-up anger and how hopeless they were because they had no hope that they would have any kind of future, let alone that their children would have any kind of future. And France would always retaliate very disproportionately. One death of a Frenchman would always lead to 50 deaths of locals. And France obviously did that to keep control and keep the fear going, but it's bizarre how that was, and it was very disheartening to read how at every step the violence just augmented. And there are parts in the book where he just describes torture methods, which were not a lot of fun. The book showed me how hard it is for a country to find balance after years and years and generations basically of not being allowed to make decisions and not having your own culture and not having a say. And it's very hard to know what your voice is. The political systems and the judiciary systems and the army and the police were, in the beginning when France left, were kicked out, however you want to look at that, they were very linked because it was the people that made sure there was independence that got the power. And obviously, because they had all the power, they misused it. Let's not think that that's only them. Any country would do that, any culture would do that. And because they misused it, there was then retaliation, there was more protests and violence and always tit for tat. And as all the parties involved are used to violence, violence is really the only way to go and to make yourself be heard, because they knew from experience that just using your voice wasn't enough. And it takes a very long time and a lot of deaths and a lot of suffering before a kind of balance has been reached. Some people think that the country that is a cause of that imbalance, namely France, should play a role in the rehabilitation, which is obviously very hard because you're the problem at the same time. And France did, in fact, they were still very involved, but what was showed was that they often still were very much friends with the people that were still committing atrocities, and they kind of looked away at what was happening. And at the end of the book, also, Andrew Hussey kind of goes back to France, and he talks about the prison system. I had no idea how bad the prison system was. Apparently, approximately 70% of the population is Muslim, and the prisons are now the place where people are radicalized, and we don't really talk about that a lot, because in France you have a separation between state and religion, and you can't discriminate people on basis on their religion. But that does not mean that we don't do it, but it does mean that that is not a part of the conversation. And people who start out with petty crime because obviously they are not accepted by France as a whole, and they're looked down upon because that's what we've always done. They have these hopeless situations, start out in petty crime because it's the only thing they see around them, go to prison, and there they become radicalized. And instead of being rehabilitated, it's actually the start of even more demise. Also, very weirdly, The last used guillotine is just happily on display in one of these prisons, in one of the biggest prisons in France, in Paris. And it's on display in the psychiatric department. If that is not a sign that we are not looking towards rehabilitation, I don't know what is. Now, there is so much I would like to tell you about what this book taught me, about what it says, but there's so much detail. I took so many notes everywhere. And obviously it's a very complex situation, so it's normal that there's a lot of detail, but I'm not going to tell you more. You should really just read this. It was so interesting, so disheartening as well, because it really showed how France is not treating its Arabs very well, and there are a lot of parallels with the situation in the US and how black people are treated. I highly, highly recommend you reading this, especially if you're interested in this topic, and if you're living in France, this should kind of be a must-read, maybe even. It's a bit long sometimes, but that's just really because there's so much detail, because it's such a complex situation. Next, I've got, it's not a physical book. I've listened to Gingerbread by Robert Disdale, completely different. It's a magic realism book, and it's set in Belarus, and we've got a mother who brings her young child, a boy, to live with her father, his grandfather, because she has cancer and she's terminal and dying. In the beginning, the three of them live together, and the boy goes to school, and in the evenings the grandfather tells stories. But very quickly the mother dies, and the two remain alone behind. And before she died, she made both of them promise to take care of the other, and she also wanted her ashes to be spread where her mother's ashes were spread, which is in the forest. Now, originally, the grandfather did not want to do that. He does not want to go to the forest. There's this thing he's afraid of. But the boy does convince him to go there. So they go, they spread the ashes, and there's also a cabin there, and it's where the grandfather, the grandmother, and the mother used to live when she was a child. And they end up spending one night there, the boy and his grandfather, and end up living there all together, because the grandfather thinks more about his past and kind of dwells back. The boy still goes to school in the beginning, but quickly that also stops. And they live in the forest permanently, and the book is about how they basically slide towards the wild, and stuff happens. I love the way it's written. I loved another book that I read by Robert Disdale, which was The Toy Makers. His style, I like his storytelling a lot. He intertwines in this book fairy tales and history, because the grandfather talks also about the Second World War and being sent to the gulags. And that is intertwined then with the life of this young boy who misses his mother and who wants to honor her dying wishes and take care of his grandfather. Now, if you plan on reading this, if you think this is your jam, a bit of fairy tale, magic realism, dark forest type, I really recommend you reading it when it's snowing. And if you're near nature, I think that would really heighten the experience. But already like this, it was a nice book. Although I will say that I liked The Toy Makers more. Anywho, those were the 3 books that I read. I have been reading Trois, femmes, puissantes by Ndiaye. This is a French book, and it translates to 3 powerful women. And I have also been reading Me and White Supremacy by Layla F Saad. This is a workbook for white people or white passing to, it says here, recognize privilege, combat racism, and change the world. It's a workbook that you do every day. So every day there's an essay, and then there's a couple of questions that you answer. And I'm on day 2, and it's forcing you to delve into yourself, so it's hoping I will learn from this. So that's all for today. Talk to me in the comments. Do you have any questions? What have you been reading? Do any of these books sound interesting? Should I read Oliver Twist, the normal version? What do you know of the relationship between your country and the country it colonized, or between your country and the country that colonized it? Hope you're well. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.